Greetings, comrades! What comes to mind when you hear the word subculture? Something vibrant, non-mainstream, and incomprehensible to the general public. Typically, members of subcultures want to express some form of protest, to show that they're unhappy with widely accepted values and norms. In their desire for self-determination, they are ready to do the craziest things. For example, wear skinny pants and bright socks, take good care of their hair, listen to jazz, and walk with a relaxed, easy stride. What? That doesn't sound all that crazy? Now here's a small detail. This subculture emerged in Stalin's USSR, when wearing a plain Hawaiian shirt was enough to get groups of activists to chase you down the street and have you denounced at Komsomol meeting. They could ruin your clothes or even cut off your slicked back hair. You could be forcibly taken to the police station on charges of hooliganism and photographed for expose articles. Such was life of the Stilyagi, the Soviet hipsters of the 1950s, who simply wanted to live like those in the West. How do subcultures actually emerge? In 1950, American sociologist David Riesman defined the concept of a subculture as a group of people who deliberately choose a lifestyle and values favored by a minority. In other words, people who want to be different from everyone else, who don't want to be part of the grey mass. Incidentally, it was precisely in the 1940s and 1950s that the first three groups of young people emerged in three big countries, groups that would later be called the first subcultures in history. In the US, these were the beatniks. America was experiencing a political shift to the right and a capitalist boom, so young people drifted to the left, rejecting consumerism and conformism, devouring the works of Eastern philosophers and experimenting with their sexuality. In the United Kingdom, the teddy boys emerged, working-class youth who adopted Edwardian-era styles from the early 20th century and emulated the pre-war golden youth as a symbol of their desire to rebel against rigid class structures and asceticism. The Stilyagi were the children of the post-war Soviet Union. What values and lifestyle could Soviet youth who disliked the idealized image of Soviet life that the authorities were earnestly trying to create have chosen for themselves? The capitalist ones, of course, Western and materialistic. Actually, all three subcultures emerged because the post-war period was a difficult time. The reasons were different. The USSR was catastrophically devastated, while the US did not face such problems. The issues were more ideological. And young people everywhere are the same. They simply wanted to live normal lives, free from boring adult culture and political mobilization. So they chose the forms of symbolic protest available to them. In a sense, the Stilyagi were the mirror image of the beatniks, but with a teddy boy aesthetic. They didn't actively protest against the authorities, they simply chose to live their own way, parallel to the mainstream. While progressive young people across the ocean were criticizing bourgeois society and reading Marx, here in the USSR they dreamed of America and wore American clothes. The funny thing is that there never really was a Stilyagi movement per se. But we know exactly where the word came from. 1949, the satirical magazine Crocodile and a column of the same name, which describes a young man whom the author calls a Stylyaga, claiming that they call themselves that. At that time, a Stylyaga was a fashionista who danced at a Lindy Hop and was extremely ignorant, unable to distinguish Tchaikovsky from Mussorgsky, yet knowledgeable about 45 types of pants and able to explain which ones were in style that season. Even the word Stylyaga itself didn't seem derogatory. A stylish person, style hunter. No, of course, in the Soviet Union, where everyone was supposed to look, think and act the same, it sounded like an insult. But in fact, Soviet critics simply invented the term Stylyaga to describe various deviant forms of behavior. For example, in the 1959 issue of the journal Questions of Speech Culture, the author of one of the articles wrote that there was a bad segment of Soviet youth and that the word Stilyagi, coined by our intelligent people, was used to put them in their place. However, there is not a single piece of evidence that any of these hipsters actually said, "I am a Stylyaga," Rather, they were quite diverse groups of young people who loved music, dancing and fashionable clothes, were interested in Western culture, and all of them were called Stilyagi at different times and with varying frequency. So, who were they? The vibrant, free-spirited young people featured in so many nostalgic films? Or the spoiled golden youth who were easily swayed by trinkets from the West? Both, actually. As I've already mentioned, the Stilyagi adopted the quiet protest of the beatniks and the shock tactics of the teddy boys. But one thing they certainly weren't was anti-Soviet, as they are sometimes portrayed. Yes, they rejected many norms of Soviet morality. They didn't want to spend their lives toiling at a workbench for the sake of the country's bright future or marching in formation at May Day parades. But at the same time they were fairly apolitical. They didn't attend rallies, something unthinkable in those years, didn't organize anti-Soviet underground gatherings, and didn't shout slogans like "Down with Stalin." Moreover, a huge segment of the Stilyagi consisted of the Soviet golden youth, the children of government officials and party workers. In other words, these were people who were direct beneficiaries of the existing Soviet system and were not particularly interested in its overthrow. Their privileged positions allowed them to travel abroad and bring back stories of a happy capitalist life, fashionable clothes, music and dances. How then did they express their subcultural disapproval of Soviet ideology? Through a distinctive lifestyle, partly modeled after that of Western youth, and of course through their appearance. Like the teddy boys, the Stilyagi were obsessed with fashion and used their flashy, provocative appearance as a form of social defiance against society. But while the British were aggressive representatives of the working class, often forming criminal gangs, for the Stilyagi, children of the intelligentsia, shocking behavior was a form of spiritual liberation, not street violence. In fact, they posed no real threat to the Soviet state. Like, really, if they wanted to dance, let them dance rock and roll. That was all they needed. They weren't interested in political games, they simply admired the glamour of the Western lifestyle. But things didn't work that way in the Soviet Union. To be considered anti-Soviet in the Union, you didn't need to criticize the system, it was enough simply not to support it. By the very fact of their existence, the Stilyagi defied the Soviet norm. From childhood, the values of collectivism had been imposed on them, yet they spoke about the freedom of individuality. They were told that the spiritual was superior to the material, yet they could spend half their lives chasing after fancy clothes. They were told that everything foreign was bad, yet they looked to the West with admiration and eagerly absorbed whatever aspects of the Western lifestyle were available to them – music, hairstyles and fashion. It's important to remember that the Stilyagi lived in an environment of limited information and shortages, so their idea of the West was a sort of reconstruction of a non-existent dream, drawn from the music, books and films that made their way through the Iron Curtain. Cinema became the main window to the outside world for the Stilyagi. And you won't believe who their first role model was – Johnny Weissmuller, specifically his portrayal of Tarzan. These were the first Tarzan films made before the war, in black and white. There was no jazz or bright clothing in them, but there was the appealing image of a young, athletic man with long hair. Then came Sun Valley Serenade. Its soundtracks Chattanooga Choo Choo, Chucha, became the anthem of a subculture, and the images of the musicians from the film became the benchmark for style. And then there were the Roaring Twenties, The Woman of My Dreams, Let George Do It, as well as film star Indiana Durbin. Of course, the Stilyagi didn't listen to Soviet music either. American jazz and boogie-woogie were highly respected. They were broadcast on Voice of America and the BBC, as well as via music on Bones. That's what they called homemade records made using X-rays, onto which trendy Western tunes, Elvis Presley, Bill Haley, Duke Ellington, were recorded. These records were distributed and played underground, in the hope that law-abiding neighbors wouldn't call the police to their apartment. Soviet dancers didn't really go with jazz and boogie-woogie either, so even the moves were copied from across the ocean. It was not uncommon for Stilyagi who performed these dances to be kicked out of public dance halls. But it's obvious that it was hard to look like Tarzan and dance jazz while wearing typical Soviet work clothes, and there was hardly any other option. To emulate real trendsetters from the West, Soviet hipsters had to resort to all sorts of tricks. For example, after World War II, soldiers returned from Europe with huge quantities of Western clothing, shoes and magazines. These items, which had often already gone out of style in the West, became the foundation of the very first Stylyagi's wardrobes. At flea markets, one could find German suits, Tyrolean shirts and Hungarian coats, which the Stilyagi altered to suit their own tastes. The subculture spread mainly in the country's major cities. It was rare to encounter a Stilyagi from a village or a remote provincial town. He simply wouldn't have the opportunity to have something tailored for himself that would even remotely allow him to fit in among the Stilyagi. Although, again, there was no such thing as a typical standardized Stilyagi look. I mean, I guess there was. There were those who first saw the Stilyagi in caricatures, were impressed by these exaggerated flashy rooster-style outfits and began to imitate them. But most often these were young people in small towns, where access to foreign films and magazines was limited. It is precisely from Soviet cartoons that the classic Stilyagi look originated. Tapered pants and jackets with exaggeratedly broad shoulders, and all of these in bright colors. In reality, things were usually a bit more subdued. It was simply that while the working class wore loose pants, the fashionable Stilyagi guys wore slim-fit ones. Shorts with broad shoulders, cane umbrellas and bright ties added a touch of audacity to the look. Girls from this subculture usually wore form-fitting American-style dresses, tight short skirts and pantsuits. The Stilyagi sported rather distinctive hairstyles. The guys wore what was known as a cock, yes, you heard that right, a cock, voluminously lifted hair, while the girls curled their hair or styled it in high updos. Another important detail in the style of female Stilyagi was red lipstick, which was bound to provoke a storm of condemnation among conservative Soviet women. Any hipsters, of course, set themselves apart not only from the grey masses, which is understandable, but also from the posers. Status among the Stilyagi was determined by how rare and authentic your clothes were. Of course, you could always just throw on a baggy double-breasted jacket, a wide-brimmed hat, bright socks and pointed-toe boots with thick soles. But did that make you stylish? No, it made you look like a clown. That's why less flashy but brand-name Western items were especially prized. Who could get their hands on those? Either members of the Golden Youth had the opportunity to travel abroad, or sailors on international trips. They were the ones who supplied the vast black market with all kinds of Western goods, the phenomenon known as fartsovka. Thanks to this hierarchy of rarity among Stilyagi, there was also a narrower subculture of shtatniki. There were only what was made in the States. And here's the problem. If you want to be a shtatnik, you can't just sew yourself a pair of Levi's jeans out of a trophy German uniform. There's no fabric like that in the Soviet Union and no one knows how to sew them that way. And even if they did, the whole point is the brand. So there's no way you, ordinary Vasi from Saratov, could be a shtatnik. Unless somehow you manage to track down some black market dealers and buy a genuine pair of Levi's from them for 10 times the price. But finding the right clothes wasn't enough. You had to know how to wear them. The Stilyagi had a distinctive way of moving that was described as exceptionally brazen. Many believed that their heads held high and their loose gait indicated their arrogance and contempt for everything Soviet. In reality, their fashionable sky-high manna porridge boots were simply difficult to walk in, which is why they moved in such a peculiar way. In the evenings, Stilyagi from different cities would stroll along Broadway, usually the city's main street, Gorky Street in Moscow, Nevsky Prospect in Leningrad and so on, to show off their outfits to everyone and then head to a disco or someone's place to sip wine through a straw. The Stilyagi's distinctive slang consisted of English loanwords adapted to Russian, combined with elements of musician slang – chuvak, хилять, drinkать and lukать. Stilyagi even adopted foreign names that sounded similar to their real Russian ones, which of course infuriated the normies around them. But you have to understand that there was no legal basis for persecuting the Stilyagi. You can't imprison or execute someone, yes, even the Soviet Union of the 1950s, just for dressing flashily and dancing to American jazz. Sure, if they were caught smuggling goods or getting into a fight on the dance floor, they could be arrested, but you had to catch them doing that first. So the authorities fought the Stilyagi in other ways, through mockery and condemnation. Today you're playing jazz, and tomorrow you'll sell out your motherland. The magazine Crocodile and Wall newspapers regularly published satirical pieces and caricatures portraying Stilyagi as ignorant and vain potential traitors. Stilyagi were summoned to Komsomol and student meetings, where they were publicly shamed and forced to reform and renounce their lifestyle. It was not uncommon for such young people to be expelled from university. Even more often they were expelled from the Komsomol, which meant the end of any serious career. It wasn't usually just because of their stylish appearance. They would typically find another justification, like a fight at a disco, and being a Stilyagi was considered an aggravating factor. The physical violence I mentioned at the beginning did happen, but more as an anomaly, excesses at the local level. There were instances of vigilantes forcibly cutting people's hair and slitting their pants, but attacking the Soviet citizens with scissors, well, that really wasn't nice. Also, contrary to a well-known myth, Stilyagi actually couldn't be jailed for social parasitism. Yes, many Stilyagi didn't want to waste their lives at a machine, but the law against parasitism, which in the USSR was punishable by up to imprisonment, didn't appear until 1961. And formally speaking, most Stilyagi were actually either working or studying. Do you know what actually put an end to this subculture? My favorite Soviet leader, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Legend has it that one day in the late 1950s, at yet another important party meeting, Khrushchev asked, "Why do we wear such wide pants? It's a waste of fabric. Let's make them narrower." And the men's pants at the turn of 1950s and 1960s did indeed become narrower, primarily for economic reasons, but also because it had already become an established fashion trend. And since everyone was wearing slim-fit pants now, it was no longer possible to stand out that way, so the Stilyagi subculture lost all its meaning. But seriously, the Stilyagi did indeed begin to gradually disappear altogether as a phenomenon during the Khrushchev Thaw. Previously forbidden elements, jazz, rock and roll and western clothing styles began to slowly become more legalized and mainstream. Dressing fashionably was no longer considered a sign of bourgeoisie or something undignified. The strict imposition of ideology began to ease little by little in the country, and people began to treat those who were different with more leniency. Finally, the first generation of Stilyagi simply grew up. Many of them became successful artists, filmmakers and musicians, such as jazz musician Alexei Kozlov or writer Vasily Aksyonov, integrating into the official or semi-official culture of the 60s. The Stilyagi faded away, as all subcultures do sooner or later, but they certainly left a very vivid mark on Soviet history. Thanks for watching. I'm going on a little vacation now, but when I come back, you may expect something slightly different from me. Stay tuned. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petr Ilich, Lyudmila Ilyanova, Jonathan Shiltse, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.